Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for attending the WAN and 5G Expanding IoT Connectivity webinar. Before we dive into the presentation, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please use the Ask a Question tab. It's located below the player. Your question will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. At the end of the webinar, please take a moment to rate this presentation and provide feedback using the Rate This tab below the player. Finally, the recorded version of this presentation will be available using the same URL shortly following its conclusion. So feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. Now I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Syed Z. Hosain. Mr. Hosain is the CTO of Aeris. He joined Aeris in 1996 and is a founder of the company. He has more than 35 years of experience in the semiconductor, computer, and telecommunications industries, including product development, architecture design, and technical management. Mr. Hosain is the chairman of the International Forum on ANSI 41 Standards Technology and chairman of the IoT M2M Council. With that, Z, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Raquel. Folks, I hope you're seeing the first screen, which has the title and my contact information, and at the end I will put up that information again. Before I get started, I'd like to add a couple of comments, one of which is that many of these slides have some fairly dense technical information on them, and for the purposes of the time of this webinar, I will not be going into exquisite detail on all of those slides. They will be available later on for you to understand and review and hopefully ask any questions that you might have down the road. So if you have any questions, would love for you to hold on to them till we get to the end or enter them, as Raquel mentioned, into the questions tab. But in the meantime, I will go ahead and proceed and get you the information over here, which I hope will be useful for you to understand what 5G is all about and what impact it will have for IoT in the future. But before I start, a little bit of information about who we are. Aeris is basically an IoT services company. We provide a complete end-to-end capability for the people who need to deploy IoT applications around the world. We are headquartered in Silicon Valley and San Jose with operations around the country as well as in the UK and India and Japan. We have a network operating centers here in the US. We have a center in London and a center in Delhi. And we are currently providing services literally in about 180 different countries, although not all of those countries have units deployed at the present time. In terms of the number of cellular units, we are in the top 10, sixth largest estimated, and we're processing well over 1.5 billion messages a day in a variety of different markets: connected cars, fleets, healthcare, financial, industrial IoT, utilities, etc. Now, the solution that we provide is a complete stack from the device to the network to the application. So if a company deploys sensors and devices in a variety of different kinds of applications and markets, we provide the connectivity support from a cellular perspective as well as hybrid technologies using cellular and Wi-Fi and cellular and satellite. This goes through a storage and management system, data transformation system for analytics, and then we can provide application development tools for that particular application for presenting that information as well as taking any actions that may be required for that application. And of course, the entire billing process, the rating and billing system that supports and underpins how these systems will work. All of this is supported with a layer of security that is essential for IoT. Obviously, the topic today is not to discuss security, but that is something else that we emphasize for IoT applications across the board. And on top of these series of capabilities, from the sensors to the connectivity to the rating and billing services, people can deploy applications, whether they're connected vehicle applications, fleet telematics applications, or additional verticals that may make sense for their particular requirement. All right, so let's dive into what 5G is all about. And I'm going to be spending more time on 5G as an overview than I will on IoT impacts, because those are still in the future. Why is 5G needed? What are the challenges? Why are the companies looking to deploy 5G? First of all, there's an expectation that there will be a tremendous growth in traffic volume. There will be a need for expanding mobile broadband capabilities for new services, and I'll describe some of those services in a moment, which will drive the need for higher performance, drive the need for greater throughput, and drive the need for additional capabilities that today's cellular technologies cannot provide. In general, there's an expectation that within the next 10 years, we'll see 1,000 times increase in the traffic volume from cellular wireless devices. Second, the number of connected devices is expected to grow quite dramatically. If you look at IoT devices, they will be providing the majority of the kinds of devices that are deployed on cellular networks. Machina Research estimated about 30 billion devices by 2025. Now, not all of those will be cellular, and as a matter of fact, a significantly small number, percentage-wise, will be cellular, and I'll show you that information in a moment. Finally, there are new applications, new use cases with a diverse set of requirements, ranging from things that might need very low latency and very high performance throughput, such as augmented and virtual reality applications, down through the typical connected car communications that you see being deployed in the past few years and today, all the way down to a large number of small sensors sending a small amount of data, which would be useful for an IoT application that is deployed. So this diversity in use cases, sort of a range of latency and speed requirements, is driving some of the challenges behind 5G. If you look at, let me expand on some of that information just a little bit. If you look at what's happening in the cellular technologies today, the number of connections that are available, this chart here is from an Ericsson mobility report that was published a few years ago, but is relatively accurate still, that the number of cellular connections, including M2M and IoT, is going to grow steadily through the years. But the technology changes will occur. 2G will get de-emphasized, 3G will start getting de-emphasized, and LTE will come on strong through the next few years. And then right at the end of 2021, you see that Ericsson is estimating that 5G will start taking off. And that's probably a very good estimate. At the end of 2021, most people will be using LTE. As you can see, that will be the largest technology shown on this chart, and then 5G will start coming in around the 2021 timeframe. The next slide is a projection by Intel about the number of subscribers. Now, what they mean by subscribers is typically cellular subscribers using this for non-IoT applications. They expect that the WCDMA, which is the 3G, GSM, which is 2G, will start tailing off in the next few years. GSM has already started down that path. But LTE will continue to grow for the next decade, all the way out to 2030. And then 5G will not peak until the 2035 timeframe. I think this is a reasonable estimate. It starts in the 2020 timeframe as the technologies get standardized and deployed, and builds up to where it starts overtaking LTE at least 15 years from now. So you can see that the current evolution of 3G and 4G continues to play a role, decreasing over time, and then 5G comes into play for the variety of applications and services that are expected to be on that technology. And as this was the estimate by Machina Research in terms of the number of cellular devices deployed by 2025 in the IoT space, as well as the fixed and short-range devices deployed for the IoT applications. The numbers are staggeringly large. As you can see, by 2025, the estimate is that 30 billion devices will be deployed, of which about 7 billion will be cellular and low-power wide-area networks. Now, that cellular will be, still by 2025, will probably still be a significant amount of 4G technologies, and LPWA, the low-power wide-area technologies, some of which will be part of the cellular space, the NB-IoT and Cat-M technologies, which are part of the 5G spec as well, will be in play. But about 7 billion devices as a whole. Now, LTE, which is long-term evolution, it is 4G cellular, is going to play a major role through this time frame, and you will not really see 5G technologies being used for IoT through the middle to end of the next decade. What are the kinds of 5G use case predictions that have been identified? The estimate by the GSMA is that 74%, about 3/4 of it, will be because people need high performance. They want an ultra-fast internet capability, gigabits per second. They want to be able to send enhanced video on a wireless channel. And then augmented reality and virtual reality applications will become a fairly significant use for 5G technologies. About 5% is in terms of use cases, is the estimate for ultra-reliable, low-latency communications, where people will be expecting to provide services that are simply not possible with 4G today, even up to the high speeds that are possible with some of the higher categories of 4G LTE. And 21% will be the growth in the Internet of Things for applications such as smart homes, smart cities, buildings, various vertical industries, etc. And of course, there will be the fixed wireless capabilities that have already started deployment, certainly in trials in many parts of the world for providing 5G capabilities, the last mile, if you will, to the homes that need to have wireless access. Next slide is another one from the GSMA, which shows the kinds of services that are expected to be deployed in 4G as well as 4G LTE as well as 5G, and what are the requirements for some of these. The vertical axis is latency. The horizontal axis is throughput, bandwidth and throughput. The white rectangle identifies the typical applications that are either in play today or are being deployed using 4G LTE networks in the upper right-hand corner of that white box, or monitoring sensing networks using some of the low-power wide area technologies that are coming into play. Where cellular has higher categories of LTE cellular have traditionally played a role, but now some of the LPWA or low-power wide area networks will become active. The gray sections will show you the kinds of applications which are expected to be beyond the capabilities of the current legacy cellular networks, services that are possible in 5G or could be enabled by 5G once the throughput and high performance capabilities are deployed. The next slide shows the technical requirement objectives that were set for 5G. First of all, they expected to be able to see a 1000x data volume increase. That 1000x is going to stretch the capabilities of wireless networks across the board, certainly for what's possible today, and therefore future technologies will need to be able to support the high throughput capability that the services requirements will need. Large growth in the number of connected devices, typically on the order of 50 to 500 billion devices in the far future, where you expect to see connected devices play a significant role. 10 gigabits per second throughput kind of numbers for the end user data rates, which are, I wouldn't call that I would call that more of a peak throughput than an average throughput, but the expectation is that people expect to see very high gigabits per second throughput capabilities. The few milliseconds end-to-end latency, which is a dramatic improvement over anything that is possible today in wireless, and of course 10 years of low power devices using batteries. Now, it is important, very important to understand and emphasize that all of these requirements cannot possibly be achieved simultaneously. If I'm going to do gigabits per second throughput, I'm simply not going to be able to do low power, 10 years battery life kind of applications. That is not reasonable or expected. The idea is that 5G is an overarching specification which has certain technical requirements which will be met by different protocols and different capabilities incorporated into the 5G specification, where some applications doing low power, low data rate will be able to survive 10 years on batteries, whereas applications that need gigabits per second or are supporting tremendous low latency applications will need higher performance, higher throughput and therefore not be able to last 10 years on batteries. Another way of looking at that is a chart that Intel developed, which on the spider chart, what you see is the various capabilities of the expected technical requirements, and then what those will support. So mobile broadband has a certain capability, mission-critical machine communications has a certain set of requirements. Again, emphasizing the fact that these various requirements will not be available simultaneously, but that the 5G spec incorporates all of them to allow people to understand what its capabilities are going to be down the road. The ITU and GSMA have also set the overall, what are called the IMT-2020 Key Requirements. This is a set of requirements that, again, I'm not going to go into exquisite detail on all of the specifics, but I want to emphasize that these are the set of requirements that they want technologies to achieve if they're going to be declared as IMT 2020 compatible or capable. And overall, the idea is to be able to increase the data rate, the peak data rate down in the 20 and 10 gigabits per second for downlink and uplink, as well as a typical user experience that is still in the 100 megabits per second for downlink, typical user experience. Again, this is a chart that I would, the set of requirements that I would expect people to look at later on. But the idea is that they're setting a target for what will be declared as IMT 2020 compliant if a technology meets these requirements. Let's look at some of the network innovations that will be required to support this. One of the key aspects of the high performance throughput of 5G is that it may require new spectrum. On the left-hand side, you see the centimeter and millimeter wave arrays that are being deployed or studied at this point for very high performance, as well as the fact that you can see IoT devices on the bottom being integrated into this network. Macro cells, which are providing capabilities typically for a long-range network, although you'll start seeing virtual core networks being used, and therefore you'll see smaller networks, perhaps remotely deployed virtual networks that interface with smaller sets of radios and smaller sets of radio broadcasts, such as femtocells, etc., coming into play. Now, the point I want to make about this is that you can see that the core is being integrated. You start seeing multiple radio technologies becoming part of a single core. And that single core will support all of these technologies, whether the requirement is for low latency and high performance or massive number of devices that are transmitting at very low data rates. You can start seeing the support put together for these kinds of network deployments, and virtual implies just exactly that. I'm not going to talk about software-defined networks or what virtual core networks means in this particular presentation, but the idea is that instead of seeing large data centers which have expensive equipment to support all these technologies, you'll see a more distributed environment being developed using core networks that are virtual in nature. The next slide discusses the spectrum issues. Obviously, 5G has some significant performance requirements, which are very difficult to achieve unless you can potentially deploy them in new spectrum. Those spectrum discussions are active. They've been active for a few years now because it takes time to finalize and test those spectrums bandwidths to see what might be usable for these new technologies. In particular, they want to make sure that they allocate new technologies which have higher bandwidths so you can support the throughput that is necessary. They believe that refarming existing spectrum, and when I say they, I'm talking about the folks who are in the discussions for allocating spectrum, that refarming existing spectrum is not going to be as easy as it has been in the past, where you only had a small set of bands. Here you may have a significant large deployment of bands which will need to be refarmed, and changing one technology for the other may not be as easy as it perhaps has been in the past. There is a group called the World Radio Congress, and the ITU basically supervises the events that take place when these meetings occur. WRC 15, which was back in 2015, set the objectives for the planning for the new spectrum needed for 5G. And they basically required that by WRC 19, that we would be able to select and harmonize, meaning make available the various bands around the world, globally, ideally, for 5G. And that was a very key requirement that was set WRC 19 is obviously not started yet. It'll happen next year, but it will be key for the mobile industry. The point I made in the third bullet is very important again. I'll reiterate, 5G needs significant additional spectrum for performance. The consideration is for spectrum to be available above 6 gigahertz, which is a good possibility because a fair amount of bandwidth available in that, generally speaking, more global bandwidth available. The centimeter and millimeter wave bands are under consideration. This is upwards of 28 gigahertz, 35 gigahertz. Some people are even discussing the possibility of using 60 and 70 gigahertz technologies for 5G. Now, having said that, there is still a need for sub 1 gigahertz for in-building penetration. If 5G is going to be using the low-power wide area technologies for low-power IoT devices, battery-operated like sensors, for example, they need to be able to have reasonable penetration inside buildings. And clearly, the higher frequencies will not get through as easily or as effectively as a sub-1 gigahertz technology. So the need for finding some sub-gigahertz technologies means that there may be some refarming in time for the sub-1 gigahertz frequencies, or new frequencies will need to be allocated for the 5G. Now, all of this work will be obviously done by the WRC 19 Congress. They're going to put together the specific bands where they expect 5G will be provided across the world, pretty much globally if they can. The trials that have already started, as you can see, about 30%, 32% of the folks are expecting to use somewhere, that's the section in red, expecting to use somewhere in the 1 to 6 gigahertz range, where 3.5 gigahertz appears to be a selection, a choice that many countries and many technology research and development companies and carriers are starting to do some trials. These are happening, as you can see, in a fair number of countries. Those trials obviously will make sure that those frequencies are available, possible to be used for 5G, etc. The section in black defines the countries that are doing trials above 6 gigahertz, with 26 and 28 gigahertz having the largest number of trials currently, and these are in play in a number of different countries, including the United States. The 28% at this point are in bands that we do not know yet what spectrum they are trialing in. But as you can see, a significant number of people are also looking at all of these bands as a cohesive capability for 5G for high performance. Right now, there's only about 2% of trials going on underneath sub-1 gigahertz, primarily because most of those frequencies are in use already for other purposes and other technologies. Let me get into some of the deployment options that carriers have. If they're deploying a 4G network today, how can they incorporate 5G into that capability? They have a variety of ways of migrating and transitioning the network portion of it. In the upper left-hand corner, you see what are called the standalone networks. SA stands for standalone, and EPC is the packet core for 4G. This is shown grayed out because the assumption is that's what you're going to have for LTE, 4G LTE today. So you have LTE and the packet core as shown as option 1 in the upper left-hand corner of that. And then there are the migration paths that you can get to 5G from that set of 4G networks that you might have. Option 2, again, is a capability that says, I want to be able to do a standalone new radio network. The new radio is the radio that will be used for 5G with the protocols that 5G will eventually require. Can I use it with a new core now called a 5GC, because that will be the 5G core? That is a standalone network with 5G. I'm not going to go through all of these options, but as you can see, there's a mix and match capability that people will deploy to migrate from 4G to 5G. Different carriers will have different paths. They may go through one option first and then eventually add another option, eventually ending up in a scenario where they'll support 4G and 5G using a new core potentially, as option 7 shows, where the 5GC supports all of the requirements for 4G today, as well as the 5G new radio technologies that are in development. Now, how will people likely do this is obviously going to take a lot of technical work. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but it shows you what path people might select. They might do a path from the base EPC systems to a standalone option 2. Now, I'm not going to go through each possibility over here, but they're going to show you what the use cases are. Can we do a 5G deployment? Can we do a mixed 4G, 5G deployment? What devices are available to me? How will I support voice under those circumstances, etc. The various options that carriers are looking at incorporate the capabilities of migration that are described over here, which typically will get supported by the equipment providers and manufacturers of equipment who are providing 5G systems down the road. As one example of what you might do to migrate from a 4G LTE network to a 5G network without having to do much more than deploy NR, which is new radio towers. The idea is that you could have cell phones that talk 4G LTE. You have cell phones that can talk 5G, the NR radio. They both connect to an existing EPC. This is one option that carriers have to start deploying 5G. Another possibility is a more complex operation where you go from the option 3 that was shown to an option 7, possibly even an option 5, where you have both LTE and a 5G system, where basically in that diagram on the right-hand side, you could have a 5G device that communicates either with a 4G tower or a 5G tower, and then eventually you could have an early 5G device that communicates with both a 5G as well as an LTE tower, both supported by a EPC, which is the 4G network core, or a 5GC, which is the 5G network core. Now, what practical approaches are people taking? SK Telecom in Korea is one of the carriers that is furthest ahead. They've actually demonstrated 5G technologies in February of this year for people who were at the Olympics over there in South Korea. They are planning to do it in multiple phases. They're going to start with phase 1, where they will deploy a NSA network only, non-standalone network only, which is an early 5G deployment where they expect to have both the 4G networks and the 5G networks being supported by the same EPC core, which is required for 4G, using a 28 gigahertz system. They will go to a phase 2 network, which will be a full-scale 5G deployment, where they will have a mixed non-standalone and standalone network in various parts of the country, eventually leading up to a phase 3 all 5G unified network, where whether you have a 4G device or a 5G device, it's all supported under the same unified network for 5G. Now that's going to be a number of years away, obviously, but this is their migration path, as you can see. Different carriers may have different approaches, but they're all going to select a way of getting from their current 4G networks to an eventual 5G network years down the road. Now, I wanted to identify in another eye chart that the differences between a 4G core and a 5G core, which is the EPC that is used for the network side, not the radio side of the technology, and then the 5GC core, which is used for the network side as well in a 5G. Again, I'm not going to go through in excruciating detail on the specific differences, but just understand that using a 4G core today for 4G LTE is not a trivial change to get to a 5G core. There are significant improvements required to support the high throughput and the latency requirements that have been set for 5G. Now, what is the ITU's timeline? Now, they put together this timeline some years ago, expecting that people would understand that 5G is going to take a while to develop all the way to the final specifications. They started back in 2014. And what you see are some requirements that were set back there, where they had people doing some early testing. They were doing some feasibilities, spectrum trials above 6 gigahertz to see what would happen. And then there was, in that time frame, in the 2014-2015 time frame, the third box, the blue box from the left, top down, shows the recommended vision of the IMT vision that they had for 2020, what they wanted to do, a recommendation that people then ratified along the way. What you can see is all the work that's going on. WRC 15 took place, where they did some of the reports from the early feasibility studies of spectrum. All of the network performance requirements and the technical performance requirements became a little bit more settled. They decided on the testing methods. And as you see timelines going out further, the IMT-2020 specifications on the bottom right-hand corner shows you when the timetable was initially set for the final IMT-2020 specifications, which 5G will conform to. This timeline was obviously subject to change. When it was introduced, a number of the carriers wanted to see it accelerated in certain ways, perhaps deploy fixed applications, fixed location applications, or fixed wireless applications, and wait for the mobility requirements and new technologies and new protocols for data encoding to occur later on. So a reality check about what really happened is that a number of carriers decided to accelerate this. A number of key suppliers decided to support that acceleration. And what you see over here are the key accelerated timelines for global 5G efforts across the board. In 2017, the trials that took place that started were with 77 different carriers in 49 countries, some of which I'd identified in an earlier chart. They were either completed in 2017 or they're active right now. The 5G specifications, the non-standalone 5G specifications, came along in the December timeframe of 2017. South Korea did a preview of 5G at the Winter Olympics, as shown over here. The US has started some fixed location trials and will be proceeding with those by the end of the year. So the point is that every market has decided they're going to try and accelerate 5G to some degree. So what happens is that 2019 is an era when, even though WRC 19 hasn't quite completed the spectrum work, you're going to see some countries doing commercial launches. South Korea, China, the UAE expects to have 5G networks available by the end of 2019. And 2020, which is when the specs come out, even though the official 2020 specs come out, you will see other countries like Japan, Australia, Mexico, various markets in Europe, and Canada have 5G available. The expectation is that by 2022, you will see 400 million people using 5G, or certainly with radios that are both 5G as well as fallback to other networks. And by 2025, that there would be more than 1.2 billion people using 5G. Now, this is a little bit of an aggressive time chart. It is an acceleration of the specifications that were put together, but certainly possible. But I would be a little surprised if many countries are able to do successful launches next year. Probably 2020 will be the era of 5G beginning to launch. All the countries like South Korea, which have made an extensive effort to do 5G today, may well get there. The next chart shows the expected adoption of 5G by region. The expectation is that by 2025, almost 50% of the radios that are sold in the handsets that are available in the United States today will have 5G built into it. Now, this does not include cellular IoT. The expectations for cellular IoT for use by 5G applications that have high performance and low latency are not yet set. So this is purely the expectation for customers who are using these for handsets and high bandwidth applications. The percentage share drops as you look at other countries. Japan is expected to have 45%, Europe about 30%, China will be about 25%, primarily because of the distribution of trying to get a large number of handsets out there to the hands of people to use 5G technologies. And globally, by 2025, the expectation is that about 14% of handsets will be 5G capable, with fallback to 4G and 3G as needed, depending on the country that you're in. The next slide shows the expected customer adoption in the United States. Again, excluding cellular IoT. In 2018 and 2019, really, there's not much there to show, except for the fact that it might have some fixed location applications for the kinds of capabilities that 5G can do for not mobile, but fixed location applications, with 5G connections starting in the 2020 timeframe and building up to where the penetration of the devices will be potentially as high as 49%, as they outlined in a previous chart, by the 2025 timeframe, meaning that the radios and handsets that are in use will be 5G capable. And if you're in a 5G market, you will be able to use 5G, but probably fall back to 4G or 3G, depending on what's available in the market you're in. The technologies in use by primary technology, and I want to emphasize again, primary technologies, meaning that the expectation is that the handset does, if it does 5G, it will still have other technologies to fall back to because the coverage may or may not be there. This is the expected timeline. As you can see, 2G has been tailing off since 2015, and at the end of 2016, there was a 2G GSM sunset. But on the other hand, CDMA is still around, and so this chart shows some of the downward trend in the number of units. But by 2023, you can start seeing the 2G networks probably cease to exist anymore. They'll be sunsetted. 3G is shown going out a little further into the 2025 timeframe, and 4G is also shown going out through 2025 and beyond. Now, the first question that people tend to ask when they see this chart is, wait a minute, why is 4G tailing down by 2025? And I want to emphasize that what I'm showing here is the primary technology, meaning that by 2025, you'll see 5G handsets that do 4G, but you won't just see 4G handsets by itself. That will start dropping by the time we get to 2025. And of course, just before we get there, the estimate is that there'll be about 190 million 5G handsets available that can also do 4G and potentially 3G as necessary. So what are the sort of the IoT futures that I might summarize over here? Clearly, there will be some IoT applications that are benefited by 5G. If you need a high data rate, if you need a low latency, if you need a video feed, if you need real-time communications, then 5G is definitely going to be something that will be useful. It enables new applications that need ultra-high performance. Now, does that mean that 4G ceases to exist? No. For a large class of applications, particularly IoT applications, 4G, particularly the low-power wide area network technologies such as Cat-M or NB-IoT, will be completely and obviously in use even in that time frame within the next decade or possibly beyond 2030. It's just that there are a small class of IoT applications where the high data rate and the low latency communication is important, and having that capability certainly within major urban areas is going to be very key. Now, if some of those applications need 5G throughput, it is unlikely that you will see them on the secondary markets or highways, mainly because if you look at the high frequencies that 5G is going to be deployed at, the need to put up towers much more closely together is going to be tough to do. And so you'll start seeing 5G applications, high performance applications, primarily in major urban areas is the expectation that I have. You will continue to see low power, low data rate transports accelerate because what is available today, such as LTE Cat-M and NB-IoT, will become very much a key part of the overall 5G IoT picture. But these are driven more by the long battery life, the low data rate, and potentially longer latency applications that can be sustained. And that's where that's where I believe it is key to understand the massive IoT growth will occur. The number of units will explode, and if you're going to see the numbers that Machina Research, for example, identified, 30 billion devices, of which 7 billion are cellular and LPWA, in that chart, LPWA is a significant portion of the units. Another important point is that 5G will take time to achieve coverage. What do I mean by that? I mean that you can start seeing the fixed location, last mile use cases that are being trialed today that will continue to be deployed in the next year or two. But general use of 5G applications is still years away. And by that, I don't mean the LPWA applications. I mean a unit and device that has a 5G radio, that has a 5G capable IoT radio module inside of it, and is using 5G technologies is still a ways away. We have to get the handsets done first. We have to get the networks done first. The coverage has to be built out. And once 5G is fully available for those technologies, that will be the point where once the radio costs come down sufficiently for large volume deployments, that 5G will overtake perhaps 4G. I don't see that happening for the next 4 to 5 to 7 years. It'll be after 2025 most likely, but I could be surprised. I'd be very surprised if it happens before 2025. So we occasionally get people asking us if I'm developing a 4G application today, is that in trouble? I mean, is it going to stay in use for a number of years, given the fact that you've seen 2G sunsets and potentially 3G sunsets happening in the next 5 years or so? The answer is yes. 4G is going to continue through 2030, and certainly the low power wide area network aspects of LTE, the Cat-M and the NB-IoT technologies will continue beyond that because they don't take a lot of spectrum. They're in the sub 1 gigahertz and sub 3 gigahertz frequency spectrums available today. And that should allow them to continue being in use because the high performance 5G stuff will always be probably be higher frequencies, 3.6 gig and higher frequencies for the throughputs that they need. So that's pretty much everything I have to cover as an overview. Hopefully you all got something out of it. I'd like to put up this final slide, which has all of the contact information for us. If there was some information that we didn't cover that you'd like to ask about in an email, that information is over there, or you can contact our various teams around the world to provide you information for what might be happening in various technologies, including 5G down the road in your local markets. We have an office in India, we have an office in Europe, and we have offices here in the US. So that's pretty much it, and I would like to open the floor up to questions, and I'm going to address some of the questions that have come up so far. And if people would like to ask additional questions, please do so. I see a couple of mechanical questions. Can we get a copy of the deck? Absolutely. Please contact us. And I think we will be providing that after the webinar is complete. We'll provide a copy of the deck as well. We will definitely have that available. My apologies to the person who's stuck in traffic. I hope you can hear it at least. And we will make the recording of the deck available to the people who need the information. So let me start with some of the questions. As this is very similar to the final point I made, but I will go ahead and elaborate on that a little bit further. As a business using IoT, how do I protect myself against fast-moving technology? That's a tough question, right? Anytime technology changes occur, it is going to impact people who are using the older technologies. When you have a cellular technology that gets sunset, like the 2G sunset that occurred a couple of years ago, and like 3G is going to happen, and then within the next 5 years or so, and 4G within the next 15 years or so, possibly 20. Yes, there will be technology changes. Yes, there will be a need for migration. So the question is, how do you handle that? There are a few obvious possibilities. First one is pick a technology that you think is going to last longer than the expected life cycle of your product. So for example, if you have an application that can take advantage of the LPWA technologies, that's going to be around potentially longer than the others. If you're developing today, clearly you do not want to do a 2G or 3G application because in some countries like the US or Singapore, 2G doesn't even exist. And in other countries, well, it does work today and it will work for the next few years through possibly the middle of the next decade. There is an end game in sight. So you probably want to be doing new technology development using LTE. Now, the obvious question arises, well, 15 years from now, LTE may be in trouble and you'll have 5G. Well, hopefully you have migrated at that point to start using those new technologies. To buffer yourself against radio technology changes, so cellular technology changes, one advice that I always give customers is to start putting the radio section as a add-on removable device. What I mean by that is potentially on a sled or pluggable device where it is relatively easy. That's perhaps not as easy as I'm making it out to be, but relatively possible to swap the radio section out so that you can protect the rest of the product out there. And that radio section can be swapped out by a non-technical person. I'm reminded of the security industry that went through this pain and anguish with the 2G sunset, and first the analog sunset many years ago, more than a decade ago, and then the recent 2G sunsets that have been announced. And the idea that they chose to do is they had to send out a tech to replace the entire product. Well, if they'd chosen to make the radio be a user replaceable part, like the battery inside an alarm panel is indeed a user replaceable part, if the radio could have been on a sled that the user could unscrew and mail back and put in a new radio, that would allow it to be a far simpler swap out. This is a capability that not all applications will be able to support. There may be additional cost issues in some degree of having a sled. There may be a little bit of reliability issues. But if you can do it, then having the ability to change the radio portion out of an IoT device out in the field, it's a good thing. And obviously, there are some LPWA networks that would potentially have a longer lifetime than that. Another question that just came in, the extended battery length was mentioned for low-powered devices. Why will this be achieved on a 5G network? Is new battery technology contributing to this better battery? Now, as I mentioned, that 5G requirements actually have a set of capabilities that don't necessarily operate together. And what I mean by that is that the high-performance 5G will not have the extended battery the capabilities. What I mean by that comment is that LPWA, the cellular IoT technologies of low power wide area networks like LPWA, technologies like CAT-M and NB-IoT are part of the 5G spec. So what will happen is that the core networks, the new networks that are being developed for 5G technologies will support a broad range of radio technologies, including the high performance 5G stuff, as well as the low power wide area networks, because that's what is needed down the road. There are a set of, these requirements may not necessarily work together. They may not happen at the same time. Now, battery technology continues to improve, but I am not as knowledgeable about that, number one, and number two, battery technologies, I believe, will still be tough to achieve because the changes that have occurred over the past few decades, at least, for battery technologies hasn't kept up with the need for storage requirements that will be necessary for the future. Another question that somebody has asked is, when do I expect that 5G radio modules for IoT will be available? And what do I expect the price to be? Boy, that's another interesting question. We're starting to see 4G CAT-M and NB-IoT radios available today at a reasonable price point where people could consider swapping from 2G, changing their product from 2G to 4G directly without having to worry about 3G. NB-IoT radios will certainly be under $5 in high volumes within the next few months, if not the next year or so. If 5G radio modules will obviously, certainly the high performance radio modules will obviously be well beyond the requirements for most IoT devices today, but more importantly, handsets have to happen first. So as people develop 5G cellular handsets, you'll start seeing the 5G radio modules for IoT become available. My own opinion, and again, this is a little bit of speculation, frankly, is that they will not be available till the early 2021-22 timeframe, if then, because handsets have to be developed well before that is possible. Another question, excuse me. Can you describe the cellular LPWA technologies that are part of the 5G overall spec? Well, as I mentioned, it's LTE CAT-M and NB-IoT. Those are topics for a separate webinar on its own, and we can provide some information about that for people who need to know. But basically, those LPWA technologies are going to be part of the overall spec for 5G and be supported in the core networks down the road. Not today, they're still separated, but they will be down the road. Another question I have is, will 5G be required for the autonomous vehicle market? Okay, that's an interesting question. There are people who believe that 5G will absolutely be the right way to go for autonomous vehicles, particularly the ones that are more autonomous than what's possible today, meaning you literally have a hands-off scenario where the category of vehicle that you're talking about may not even have human intervention involved. I would like to make sure that people understand what 5G requirements are. It's going to have high performance, it's going to have low latency, but the needs for a truly independent autonomous vehicle are well beyond even what 5G could potentially provide for certain situations, meaning if a car is going down the road and it's fully autonomous, it's going to need to react to capabilities that are significantly faster than anything that 5G could provide, meaning literally milliseconds of response to avoid collisions, to avoid people, to avoid having a situation where the vehicle has an accident because it simply didn't have the capability of responding to an event that is very local. So you will see a tremendous amount of local processing, the tremendous amount of data being processed by the vehicle. Where 5G will be useful is to be able to do in-time rapid updates, for example, from map updates for a vehicle going down the road, where the latency from the vehicle to the network, even though it's going to be very short, isn't in the way for rapid responses to a event in the highway or the road where the cars could have an accident because they didn't have the information fast enough. It's more going to be, you're not going to see remote control of vehicles. You're not going to be able to see that kind of capability enabled by 5G. What you will see is information processing available such that the localized processing in an autonomous vehicle can use that remote information in time for whatever application function is required for that autonomous vehicle to do. How are we doing on time? So that's some time left. So, okay, let's take a couple more questions. Are there any 5G handsets available yet? Well, no, not yet. Trials, I'm sure, are underway. I don't know of anybody that is making a commercial 5G handset, although I'm sure there are radios that are being used for these trials, and I'm sure there are radios that were demonstrated, for example, at Mobile World Congress in Spain earlier this year, which showed the capabilities that you will be able to achieve down the road. But I do not know of any commercial 5G handsets available for obvious reasons, since the 5G networks are still not there yet. Networks will happen first, handsets will happen later on, and that's how it will proceed. Any other? Okay, very good. Okay, the question is more about our company. So let me address some of these answers, and I can take some of them offline, but is the company's sole growth through customers? Yes, clearly. Aeris is a company that provides capabilities to customers. We provide these primarily to enterprise businesses, small, medium, and large, or anybody who needs to have IoT capability, whether it's from a complete solution perspective, from device through the delivery of that data, or even some pieces of that. If you download the presentation, the second slide on Aeris covers our capabilities and what we do. In terms of our support for, do we have a channel? The question was, do you have a channel? Yes, absolutely. On the screen, you should see the ways you can contact us, either with a phone call or email, and you'll get through to the people who will provide information about how we do things. We also provide our services and capabilities through additional channels, the traditional channels for electronics equipment that you might be familiar with. If you look on our website, you'll see all of that capability. What markets do have the greatest footprint? What markets have the greatest footprint? Is it European markets, Asia Pacific, or Americas? That's an interesting question, and let me talk about it from the perspective of general global cellular IoT. If you look at the top IoT markets for cellular deployments, the largest country in the world that has deployed cellular devices for IoT applications is China. China Mobile has well over 90 million devices deployed today. China Unicom, China Telecom, they all have large numbers of units, and you add those up, and they probably account for the majority, or I wouldn't say 50%, but certainly 35 to 40% of the cellular IoT devices deployed today. Europe and the United States are North America, I should say, are relatively close in the few 100 million to 300-400 million devices. That's total as an aggregate whole. There is an estimate that there are probably about 600 million cellular devices around the world, 700 million cellular devices around the world. I don't know how accurate that estimate is. It varies between 500 and a billion, 1.2 billion. It's going to continue to grow. That chart from Machina showed that cellular devices ought to account for a total of 7 billion devices by 2025, of which probably on the order of 3 to 4 will be 4 billion, 4.5 billion will be on the order of will be for LPWA devices, and on the order of about 2.5, maybe 3 billion cellular, non-LPWA cellular devices around the world. I had another question. Where can you, okay, well, I already covered that one, I'm sorry. I am developing a 4G LTE IoT application at the moment. Will this effort be negated by 5G availability soon? Well, no, because as I mentioned, 4G LTE is first, it's part of the 5G spec, but more importantly, I expect 4G LTE to last through the end of the next decade. This is very similar to the original question I got, which is how do I protect myself against fast-moving technologies? Today, 4G LTE applications are really the choice that you have. I would not do a 2G or 3G application, particularly in the United States, or a new application, particularly in the United States or in the European markets. I'd certainly be looking at 4G LTE. And in other markets, I might consider doing a new 2G, 3G application, but I would want to migrate to 4G as quickly as I could do so. Now, will this effort be negated by 5G availability soon? No, because the coverage for 5G will take time. I don't expect to see any significant availability for IoT applications, either from a radio coverage perspective. This will vary across the world, obviously, but you're not looking at any kind of real reason to start looking at 5G solutions until the middle of the next decade, probably. And in some countries, maybe even later. 4G LTE is here to stay for the next 15 years and possibly longer, and that's what we should be developing towards. Let me see if I see any other questions. No, I think that is pretty much all the questions I see. If there's anything that you would like to have answered later on, we'd greatly appreciate if you could contact us. You see our contact information, both the phone numbers and the emails that you can use. And obviously, if you want to go to our website, you can get additional information. This presentation will be available for download very shortly. The URL for it and the recording will also be available. And if you all have any additional questions after the fact, please contact me directly as well about the presentation, or if you want to get more information about Aeris, then those general numbers and email addresses are what you should use. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you, Raquel, for introducing me. And let's wrap this up and give a few minutes back to the people. Thank you much. Bye-bye.